Hello and a warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for the Carrie Barrett Show. This is our weekly live stream, Thursdays at 10 a.m. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here with us. As you know, our episodes are jam-packed with tons of valuable insights for you. It's for the innovators, it's for the leaders that are shaping the future. We're all about turning your potential into an exceptional on-camera presence and a powerful communicator. So let's dive in. And a quick reminder, if you have questions, if you're joining us here live, to go ahead and put them in the comments. Today, we are talking about why those filler words are not deal breakers when you are in front of a live audience, whether you are on the stage or whether you are in front of a camera. When they do get to become distracting, and how you can potentially cut or at least reduce the amount of filler words that you use in your speech. So let's start at the very beginning. What exactly is a filler word? Your filler words are those standard sort of, they're called words, but they're more like sounds. They're ums, ahs, like, right? Those sort of standard crutch sounds or words that we use when we don't know exactly what it is that we're going to say. Now, there can actually be some use for those types of sounds or words when you are in front of a live audience, when you're in person, or when you are talking to someone or with a group through a lens. And they're potentially useful when you're taking a moment to gather your thoughts, but you want to signal to the audience that your thought, your sentence, whatever it is that you're going to be iterating is not completely over yet. Now, I've heard women that I work with and just anecdotally say that they find that they tend to use those sorts of sounds or words to indicate to their live audience that I'm not done, don't interrupt me, I still have something that I'm going to say. Women say that they have a tendency to use words in that particular scenario as a way to indicate to their usually majority male audience that they're not ready to be interrupted yet. And as we know, women do have a tendency to be interrupted more often than men. It's changing. That's good news. But there is still some specific battles that we as women face that perhaps our male counterparts do not. When you're thinking about a live presentation, and I'm going to sort of leave recorded presentations or video out of this discussion. And the reason for that is through post-production, editing, etc., especially now with AI editors, it's very, very easy to remove any use of a filler word or sound, or an excessive use of those filler words or sounds, just by clipping them out of the transcription, and then the video will edit itself through that. So I'm going to leave them to the side, because when you're recording something and it's going to live for a while, it's going to have some durability, if you will, it is more important to try and remove any excessive use of filler words. People have a little more generosity when they're listening to something live, because they recognize that it is raw and there are going to be fumbles or stumbles, and that's expected. There's never a perfect live video or a perfect live presentation or keynote. I've already made mistakes here myself. In fact, I just made one. So that recorded element is not part of this discussion. If you do have questions about editing or how to reduce the need for post-production when you're making a recorded video, it will still apply. What we're talking about here today and the methods for reducing them will still apply to you, but we're talking specifically about live video here. So you may have heard specifically people who are involved in groups like Toastmasters, for example, count how many ums and ahs that they use during a speech. And their goal is to get ums, ahs, likes, those sorts of things down to zero. I'm here to tell you that I kind of think that's a silly thing to do. They're a natural idiosyncrasy of normal human conversation. We use them often when we are gathering our thoughts, and they range from small, which is about zero point 0.2 seconds, to medium, which is about half a second, to what is considered a long pause. Again, this is a natural conversation that usually lasts about a second. Really great speakers know that there is power in a longer pause. And in fact, you'll see keynote speakers, people who are professional speakers, use pauses for up to 3 to 4 seconds or perhaps even longer. And that's because there is some power in the pause rather than filling that blank space, if you will, with a sound. As an interviewer, in my former career as a journalist, one of the most powerful methods of interviewing people was to let them pause, because we don't like the sound of silence. So if I was asking somebody a question and it was a question that they didn't really want to answer, they'd give sort of a non-answer and then they'd stop speaking, rather than jump in to fill that silence, which is why we use filler words. We don't like it. In the TV news world, we called it dead air. It still feels very awkward when we're up on a stage or in front of a lens to have silence. We feel like we need to be talking all the time. So that's why, as an interviewer, when somebody didn't want to answer a question and they stopped short of answering it, or they gave me a non-answer, rather than jump in with a follow-up or a prompt, as a skilled interviewer, you sat there in silence, because then the impetus was on the interviewee to jump in. And often they would, because they don't like that sound either. And then they would jump in and fully answer the question. So recognize that there is power in that silence or in that pause. And that often when we're conversationally speaking, rather than use a filler word, if we do pause, we pause maybe 3 times a minute. I know I'm throwing a lot of statistics at you right now, and that's really not a good use of video, but it's important for you to understand some of the science behind this. 3 pauses a minute is actually usually not quite enough. You can use more. When you're thinking about doing a live presentation or a live video, and you're practicing and you're trying to figure out how many filler words you use, record yourself. Don't practice in front of a mirror. You'll hear a lot of people talk about practicing in front of a mirror. And while that can be beneficial, you're trying to deliver and you're trying to critique yourself at the same time. You're doing too many things and you can't do either one very well. So I suggest, and it is more laborious because you have to go back and watch, I suggest recording yourself and pick a random 2 to 3 minutes in parts of your presentation or your speech and count your ums and ahs in that particular spot. And you want to do that in a few spots throughout and see if there is some consistency. While using a few filler words here and there is fine, when you begin to overuse them, when you find that you're using them, let's say 20 times in the span of 2 or 3 minutes, and that's not unusual if someone's uncomfortable, it does begin to degrade your credibility. It does begin to disengage your audience because they feel awkward. They feel like you feel awkward. And so they begin to sort of remove themselves from that moment because nobody wants to feel awkward, you or your audience. So if your ums or ahs are getting to the point where you feel like you are overusing them, and if you're not sure, run it by someone, ask them to take a listen and see what they think. Then there are some strategies that you can use to reduce the use of filler words. And the first, I sort of touched on a moment ago, and that's to become aware of how often you're using them. And so that's where that recording begins to come in handy. You have to go back and listen and really figure out, am I overusing them? And if I am, are there specific circumstances that I have a tendency to do that more often? And it could be when you're asked a question at the end of your keynote and you're sort of fumbling around for an answer. It could be if there is a portion of your keynote where you feel, or your speech or presentation, where you feel like you're not as familiar with the content or you don't know it quite as well. You may find that it's when you're sharing a personal story and you feel a little bit more raw or a little bit more vulnerable because you're not talking about business, or you're not talking about data or statistics, you're sharing a little bit of yourself. And that can be a spot where people have a tendency to use more filler words because they're uncomfortable. And so my suggestion to you would be to figure out which one of those three, or if there is another circumstance that arises for you that you tend to use those words more often as a crutch, and then focus on those specific areas first. And once you have a handle on those, then begin to move into the other spots. So how do you do that? As you're watching your presentation or your speech or your video or your live stream or podcast, whatever it is, find 2 or 3 minutes where you rely more heavily on those words. And then I want you to take that clip, that 2 or 3 minute clip, and go back and re-record it, if you will. I don't want you to focus on looking great, worrying about the camera, having a lot of energy. Your specific task in this is to think about those filler words. And so you will take that 2 or 3 minute clip and you'll just talk it. Don't present it, just verbalize it. Go back and listen and focus on removing those filler words where they appeared in that recording. Go back and make another recording. And again, concentrate on where you're using those filler words and being deliberate in trying to remove them. And I want you to do that 5 times in a row. Don't spread it out. Give yourself, 5 repetitions. And again, if you're pulling a 2 or 3 minute clip, this whole exercise with review will probably take you 30 to 35 minutes. So block out a little bit of time for yourself so that you can actually focus on it. Do it 5 times and then go back finally and look at the difference between the original clip, the one that was in your presentation, and your final recording, that 5th time around where you're really being deliberate about removing those filler words. And see, there will be a difference between the first and the last. It probably won't be perfect because those words are so baked in when we're feeling at a loss or when we're struggling to find the next thing that we want to say. And we want to keep the audience, we think, engaged by letting them know we're continuing to speak, or they're not having a technical issue. We haven't frozen, those sorts of things. And so they're very baked in. So it's not going to take 1 or 2 rounds of this for you to reduce your filler words. You're going to have to be deliberate about practicing, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes. I would say if you can, try and do it every day. At the end of the day, make a little bit of time for yourself in the morning. If you're doing recorded video content, practice it then, because it'll help you in post-production. It'll be less laborious in post-production if you've removed some of those ums and ahs. There's 2 other methods that I use with clients who are focused on this specifically. And the first step is always becoming aware. The second is, as you feel that or ah, or like, or, does that make sense? Which is one that I tend to rely on. As you feel them beginning to sort of bubble out, and as you become more aware, you'll notice them before they come out of your mouth. Pause, maybe look away for a second, do something physical with your body. Sometimes it's tap your leg out of sight of your audience, the way I'm doing now. Do something physical. Gather your thought. Looking away is an indicator to your audience that you are gathering your thoughts, and then look back at the camera or look back at the audience and re-engage. You almost want to give yourself a second to swallow that word while recognizing that pausing is much more powerful than filling with a non-verbal vocal utterance, if you will. So moving your body, creating a physical sensation, tapping the leg, turning away, and then re-engaging as you come back. Finally, the third method, aside from being aware, creating a physical sensation in your body when you sense those words are about, or those sounds are about to be vocalized or uttered, is actually literally swallowing them back. So the word may start to come out of your mouth, and just stop it. Stop it and look away and think at that moment about what it is that you want to say. And if it takes you 5 seconds or 8 seconds to figure out what it is, that's okay. The goal of this particular episode, or this particular training method, if you will, not episode, is to become okay with feeling the silence or hearing the silence. That is often the hardest part. Even once you're aware of how often you're using those words and you begin to create some alternatives to distract and regroup, you're going to have to use a pause every now and then. And sometimes they're going to take a while. Sometimes they may be 5 seconds. I'm going to give you an idea of what that sounds like now. Starting, go. That can feel very awkward, very uncomfortable when you're up on a stage or you're in front of a live audience. Part of what your goal is here is to desensitize yourself to that feeling of awkwardness. Again, going back to what I mentioned about being an interviewer in the world of journalism, it's awkward. And we know that, which is why we rely on it to get people to continue talking and saying things that they don't necessarily want to say. So the goal here, again, is to desensitize yourself to that feeling of awkwardness and instead use it as a way to create a powerful moment or a powerful turning point in your live stream, podcast, town hall, presentation, whatever it is that you're doing, where someone or a group of people are viewing it live. Now, you can use this in anything that you're doing. It could be a client pitch. It could be a coaching or training call that you're having with a client. It could be a discovery call or a strategy session. These are applicable in every single one of those situations. Oftentimes, if we have a large portion of whatever it is that we're saying that's off the cuff and ad lib, that's generally where most people will find that they rely more heavily on crutch words. When they have a script and they know where they're going, even if they're not following it word for word, and we've practiced, that's key, getting from point A to point B, C, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we tend to have a better feel for where we're going and what we're doing. And even if the words don't come to us exactly as we had them written, we know where we're going, and we have a tendency, most of us, to use them less often. For many, it's where we have those ad lib or extemporaneous moments in our presentation, speech, et cetera. And so that's why it's applicable when you're having a discovery call or a strategy session or a client pitch or an investor pitch, because we'll all have those moments. If we're doing them right, there should be moments where we're speaking off the cuff, answering a question, et cetera. So those are the moments to be most aware of when you are practicing reducing those filler words. So let me just sort of go back and recap. Today's episode is going to be sort of short, but I'm always here if you have questions. Filler words, to recap, they're not a deal breaker. They are a natural idiosyncrasy of normal human communication. Do not make it your goal to never have one. Do not count the ums and ahs over the course of a 30-minute speech unless they're excessive. I've never in my life heard somebody say, wow, that live stream was awesome, or that keynote was awesome because he or she didn't say at all. That doesn't have anything to do with the way that you connect with the audience. Again, if they're excessive, that's when they become a problem. That's when they can create or diminish your credibility, create disengagement with the audience, because you seem nervous, they get nervous, etc. But to make it a goal to never say or ah is a ridiculous waste of your time. And I don't want you to do it. Save yourself a little bit of grief. Again, if you find there are moments where you are overusing them or you're relying on them, again, usually when we're telling a story, we feel vulnerable and uncomfortable. Often, most often, when we're ad-libbing or speaking extemporaneously or off the cuff. And then thirdly, often when we are speaking about something that we don't necessarily feel like we fully have our arms around. Maybe we're not as familiar with this particular piece of content. So that's where most people fall, one of those three situations when they begin to rely heavily. In order to remove some of them, pick a spot in a presentation where you notice you're relying particularly heavy on filler words, 2 to 3 minutes, and then re-deliver that 5 times in a row, each time focusing on removing additional words, and then go back and watch the original and the last. And those 3 tips for removing them, that's the first. The second is to create a physical sensation with your body, turning your head, maybe tapping your leg, gathering your thoughts. And then the third is to get comfortable with the silence, which for most of us is the trickiest part. We might get to a second or two, and if we haven't gathered our thoughts, then we start to spit out a series of nonverbal utterances. Get comfortable with up to 5 seconds of silence. And remember that most of us, when we're delivering a keynote or a presentation on camera, don't nearly use enough pauses, and they're not as powerful as we can make them. If you figure out how to get comfortable with the sound of silence, you can turn that moment into a very powerful, pivotal point for your speech or your presentation. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Carrie Barrett Show. I will see you back here next Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern. Have a fantastic day.